This presentation is on representation and gaze. Perhaps the most important point that Hall makes in the video that we watched about representation, um, Hall rejects the idea that events have meaning in and of themselves. Instead, his theory is that we create meaning when we talk about, or in the media broadcast about, what happened. This is a process of interpretation. The media does not simply present events like they're reflecting the world in a mirror. Instead, they represent events, or represent, right? They present them with interpretations of meaning layered on top. This is, of course, what we expect in fictionalized radio, TV, or internet broadcasts. We easily recognize TV shows like Game of Thrones as representations with layers of meaning. On one level, of course, Game of Thrones is just a drama, but it's easy to see that it represents various ideas and worldviews. The characters are in many ways archetypes. They represent ambition, violence, moral men and moral women, the psychology of murderers, etc. The show also represents Europe's, or at least Great Britain's, Middle Ages. By fictionalizing a single story, it gives us an opportunity to wonder what Great Britain was like when there was no electricity and no cars, and when there were knights running around the land fighting each other. The show is pretty clearly set in a fictionalized version of Great Britain that is writ large. The shape of the map is an enlarged and elongated version of the British Isles. The heraldry of the great families in the show mimics British medieval heraldry during the Wars of the Roses. The wall is an enlarged ice version of Hadrian's Wall across the Isle of Great Britain, built by the Romans. Valyria is an analogue to Rome, which was also gone by Great Britain's High Middle Ages. To keep out the wild Northmen, the so-called first men of the British Isles, is what the wall is intended to do. Author George R.R. Martin has himself admitted to inspiration during a trip to Britain that involved a tour of Hadrian's Wall. So we can say that Game of Thrones is a representation of Britain's Middle Ages. However, Hall is also, even mostly, talking about nonfiction. The TV news is one of his examples. Despite the claims of news organizations to give us objective facts only, their presentation of events is always, and can only be, a representation. The meaning is not inherent in the event, but created through the representation. By the simple act of putting it on TV, the news is telling us that it, whatever it is, has been judged important enough to be on TV during a 30-minute or 1-hour period in which they claim to give us a summary of the whole day around the globe. This summary, by necessity, leaves out most of what happened in the world during that period. The news editors and the company's news policy, along with their guiding ideology, usually called their editorial policy, decides what is important enough and what is not important enough to make the broadcast. That in itself is representation, assigning meaning through assigning importance. But many, if not most, news organizations also interpret events for us to some degree or other. That, of course, depends upon why the editors believe a certain news item is important, and what impact they believe it will have on their viewers. They also learn as much as they can about their viewers and present news that their viewers are likely to be interested in, through an interpretation that their viewers likely approve of. They are not, therefore, giving us objective information, only representing events to us through their own prism of importance, meaning, and audience expectation. On the internet, that tendency is even more pronounced. Since the internet has so many different viewers and so many different producers, audiences are fragmented and producers cater even more to their audience's interests. One way that media, including anime and manga, represent information to their viewers and readers has to do with an idea called gaze, which we'll look at this week. Gaze is an idea about how visual media is constructed based on who the producers assume to be the target market, that is, who's gazing or who's watching. At its simplest, we can say that gaze is a function of gender. In general, theories of gaze suggest that men like to look at women and women like to look at men. Now, of course, there are problems with even this simplest idea about the gaze. We know that gender is constructed and performative. That is, not all men like to look at women, and not all women like to look at men. So gaze is complex from the beginning. Still, we can say that visual media, photographs, videos, images of other kinds, are constructed. That is to say, it is naive of us to believe that a photograph, for example, shows reality. Instead, images and visual media in general make meaning. They don't capture it. If there's a meaning inherent in an event, that meaning is best conveyed by being present at the event. When photographers, journalists, and videographers capture the event, they may be present, but they can only show part of the story, and usually they frame it in such a way that it makes sense to them. So at best, when we witness events through visual media, we're getting someone else's choices about what's important. More likely, we're getting the whole meaning from the media that we consume. The usual admonition when someone makes it clear that you're only getting part of the story or getting someone else's story is that you should be critical of the media you consume. But what, in fact, does that mean? In this case, Stuart Hall's 3 interpretive strategies help out. We can interpret events as meaning what the author intended them to mean, presuming we can identify what that is, which may be impossible. However, our interpretations may, more than likely are, more of a negotiated meaning. That is, we bring our own lived experience to the table when we consume media. So we may accept part of the story that we're being shown, but we may also filter it through our own beliefs, experiences, and practices. Thus, even if we don't mean to do so, we really are almost always negotiating the meaning of a visual product. I can give you an example of this. When I was growing up in the Pacific Northwest, urban neo-Nazis identified themselves by wearing a specific kind of fashion and shaving their heads bald. We and they called themselves skinheads. Now that I'm older, our culture has changed, and I've moved to Hawaii. So I have a problem. One of my close friends has shaved his head. This is not because he's a neo-Nazi. He's about as far from fascist as it's possible to get. He shaved his head because he was, well, losing his hair, and decided rather than combing it over, an honestly bald head was his preference. Now, this is a solution I can respect, but the first time I saw it, in my own mind, I wondered why he would want a neo-Nazi haircut. In other words, while my friend was trying to communicate extended youth and energy to the world, I was reading something else. When he explained, I understood, but I still have thoughts of neo-Nazis. So the head holds a negotiated meaning for me. This is completely involuntary. I did not choose to think of his fashion statement in that way. It simply connected with memories from my own experience, and those added meanings for me. This example brings up some important points. First, we can't really know what the author, in this case my friend who shaved his head, means in any given instance. Second, whatever the author may mean, we may agree. That would be the dominant hegemonic interpretation. But it is also involuntary because we cannot agree with the author since we don't know her intent. In the same way, the negotiated meaning is not something which we consciously choose. Instead, we accept part of what we see and don't accept other parts. Thus, the oppositional interpretation is similarly a response, but not necessarily a conscious one. We can reject whatever message we see coming from the image, or read it as meaning the opposite of what others think it does. We can see that in the slide here. If we look at Bruce Springsteen's song Born in the USA, the dominant hegemonic meaning, the meaning that is most commonly used by most people, is that this song celebrates the United States, that it's a patriotic song. The intended meaning, at least interpreting it from the lyrics, suggests that it's actually a much more specific critique of the failure of steel mills in the industrial heartland of the United States in the 1970s. The negotiated meaning might suggest that it sounds patriotic, but it's also critical of the way that jobs were lost in the 1970s and jobs were sent overseas, etc. The oppositional meaning to this song might be to interpret it as a completely anti-American song and one that holds special meaning for people who feel anger towards the United States. So all four of these are possible according to Stuart Hall's system of interpretations. And what we have to do when we analyze an audience is figure out which of these they are using. More commonly than not, it is the negotiated meaning, and that means that there will be a lot of subtle negotiated ideas about it. Well, the point is that representation makes meaning rather than conveys meaning. Thus, when representations are created, their creators make certain assumptions about who's watching and what they want to see, or they make unconscious choices about how to present things based on their own experiences. The audience interprets things based on what they want to see and the way that they choose to understand the images and audio that they receive. So we can say that they both create representations based on the gaze that is most familiar to them, what they're looking at and the way they look at it, or that they consider most appropriate for the subject matter. That is, the way the producers look at things is the way they are presented in visual media. This is most commonly from the perspective of men, even when the producers are women. And the way that audiences look at things is often based on our assumptions that things will be presented from the perspective of men. And so we call this dominant view the male gaze because it tends to put men and men's interests at the center of most images. And you can see that again in the slide here. On the left side, you see the Vampire Diaries, and on the right side, a scene from Love Hina, the Japanese anime. And you can see that these are definitely intended for two different audiences. In fact, here's an example of the male gaze in just one image and another image that challenges it, so that we can see the difference in a starkly illustrated way. Sometimes we kind of have to start by making it really obvious. And you might wonder, what does the female gaze look like? That is a difficult question because it may not look at all like the male gaze in opposition. Thanks for listening and have a great day.